Hi.
Hello?
Hi guys, can we do a mic testing right from the OG? So, OG, are they hear it?
Hello? Member of government here?
Can the two speakers from the OG do mic testing so that we are sure that we can hear you guys?
I 1 2 3 2 4 1 2 3 1 2 3 mic.
Okay,
Hi, if this is okay.
okay, we
Testing.
can, yeah, we can hear you. Oh,
Oh, here.
Here. Am I audible, right? I'm audible, right?
yeah,
Yes,
you're
yes.
audible.
Yes, you are.
CO,
Yes.
CG,
I'm CG member.
okay, and Whip.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Yes.
So, Fardeen, are we waiting for someone or are we starting this?
Mr. Speaker, understand that we live in a society in which harassment is normalized, especially those in the workplace, which often go unnoticed and outside of the domain of the court. We believe, as OG, we believe that this sort of harassment, this violation of human rights, this violation of basic rights granted to individuals by the Constitution, is well within inside the domains of the court, and therefore must remain inside the domains of the court and should not be settled outside. What do we define as a settlement in terms of this debate? We think that outside of court settlements are generally done in monetary terms. They're done in legal contracts that prevent the victim from going to the court and accusing their harasser or accusing the person of what it is they're guilty of and obtaining a verdict from the court. We believe that these settlements, because of their nature as being monetary, they are mostly provided by the rich, by the people in power, by people who initially, Mr. Speaker, are the ones in positions of power to harass these women, to impose themselves on women, to rid them of their bodily autonomy. These people are a part. These people are a part of an elite group that is able to give these settlements and persuade women not to go to court. We tell you that these monetary settlements are these monetary settlements, being economic, are alienating to a certain demographic inside society and therefore perpetuate the power of the rich. What do we have? What do we as OG bring to you in this debate? We talk to you about the principle and why it is absolutely necessary for the CGS to mandate these sort of things. The moral code, Mr. Speaker, on which any punishment is to be dealt must be done according to an accepted constitution, according to the rule of law. When a punishment is dealt with outside of the CGS, it corrupts the functionings of the CGS and does not grant society a pillar on which it can stand. What do we mean by this? When a settlement is done outside of court, this perpetuates a narrative that the individual is is unable to is able to maintain the sort of power because of this narrative. What do we mean by this? We mean that not bringing it to the court means that this crime is not worthy of going to court. It means that harassing somebody and taking away their bodily autonomy is something that is not worth going to court over, and simply you can spend money and make this crime go away. What does this do, Mr. Speaker? It creates a narrative that money is greater than somebody's bodily autonomy, than somebody's right to having bodily autonomy. How does this narrative impact society? It impacts society on an individual level. This means that an individual who is living inside a society in which settlements are taken outside of the court believes that they as an individual, number one, Mr. Speaker, they retain their position of power. How do they retain their position of power? When the issue does not go to court, they are not faced with a jury. They're not faced with a public hearing. They're not faced with public ire or any kind of besmirch on their reputation. Instead, these people who have already categorized as being very rich, as having money, these people are unable to these people maintain their position of power. They don't need to succumb to the level of other ordinary citizens and have a fair hearing. Instead, because they maintain their position of power, they 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 take in this narrative of having power, and therefore they are unable to change their mindset, Mr. Speaker. They are unable to believe that the crime they have committed is worth going to court. This creates thousands of individuals in the upper strata of society that that do not that do not have a socially progressive viewpoint, Mr. Speaker. This means that these people will not be going will not be able to think of women in a high regard. They will not be able to see women as other things than objects. Objects that once they're done imposing their will on these objects, they are free to simply pay money and let them go and go back to their normal lives. They don't see these women as being important because of this narrative which the current status quo is providing them with, this sort of safe haven for these people, not to go to court, not to have their reputations tarnished, and of course the easy way out, which is to just give them money and not be that. Mr. Speaker, understand that in this debate, while the victim of a crime is definitely an important stakeholder, we as the OG believe that the greater stakeholder is society as a whole, because our ban on these sort of settlements, our ban on these settlements from going on monetary settlements and forcing these to go to court, we do understand that it will impact the victims as well as the accused as well as everybody else. But we believe that society as a whole needs to be the main stakeholder of this debate, and we believe that removing this narrative and creating a society in which these settlements are seen as unacceptable, in which the court is responsible for handling these problems, is a better society. Is a better society simply because of the better narrative that it creates. That is the narrative that you must be responsible for the decisions you make, and that everything you hold is accountable to the law. Why do we believe that? Why do we believe that the punishment, according to a moral code, according to the CGS, is more important? We believe that these settlements given by the person that are not correct punishment, Mr. Speaker. They're not enough punishment, because a punishment dealt with for something of this nature, for something that harms the bodily autonomy of an individual, must be according to the Constitution. When this individual has a punishment that is outside of the Constitution, this, number one, does not seem like a crime which is worthy of a greater punishment, and number two, they're able to be punished according to a moral principle that is not equal for everybody, Mr. Speaker. And in a society where different people are able to get away with the same crime for different layers of for different severities of punishment, we believe that the society as a whole is not equitable to individuals, Mr. Speaker. The society becomes less important. The society becomes unable to have a strict constitution, a strict rule of law. And what does this create, Mr. Speaker? Number one, it creates what does this create? The idea that there is no strict rule of law or equitableness. Number one, it gives you the idea that people can get away with things, and people of different taking the BOI. I'm sorry, I don't know how to do this.
If this out of court settlement is a decision these people actively want to make after they feel like they've been failed by the justice system, why do you think it's not a legitimate decision these people should be allowed to make?
Well, given that these people, if you're talking, I'm assuming that you're talking about the victims in this case, right? We believe that the victims themselves must be obligated to the law, Mr. Speaker, and we believe that when these victims are forced to go to the law for any kind of settlement of workplace harassment, this makes sure that any kind of harassment is seen as having such gravity that it must be taken to the court, and this allows the society to be more intolerant towards these kind of crimes, which we believe that because of the status quo are going unnoticed. We believe that the mentality of victims who have been robbed of their bodily autonomy, their mentality to just say, okay, I agree with this, okay, it's fine, I'll take the settlement, is a problem with the society not giving the crime the gravity that it deserves. We believe that in the society created by OG, in a society where we do ban these settlements, people will begin to realize that they have been robbed of their freedoms and they have been continuously pushed down by this elite status of people. We believe that these people, considering their different, considering the fact that considering the fact that they have already been abused by the rich, by the people with power, are more likely than not coerced into taking these settlements, Mr. Speaker, in the belief that, in the constant threat that their public image will be harmed or something bad will happen to them as a result. However, we believe that this is a narrative created by those who in themselves are in the power to grant that settlement. Therefore, we believe that if it means temporary, let's say, the temporary discomfort of the victim in going to court, we believe that it's worth it in the long run, because in the end, we'll be creating a society that's less tolerant of these horrible actions. And we believe that this is better as a whole, because one is more principally just for everybody to be receiving the same kind of punishment for the same kind of crime, unlike in the current status quo where different levels, let's say, of harassers are obtaining different sorts of punishments for their crimes, which is creating an inherently unequal society that isn't based on rule of law or really anything. And we also believe that this narrative is more helpful, number one, to society and to the victim at large. We also believe that having this ban on out of court settlements will create a greatest deterrent to further harassment in the workplace, because when somebody who is in a position to do this, is knows that committing this crime, they will not be able to get away with it as a settlement. They will not be able to get away with it simply through money. They will be far less likely to commit the crime in the future. And as a result, this helps the CGS. In saying this, I'd like to conclude by saying that the individual narrative is destroyed. We have a more equal society, and of course, a deterrent, which my DPM will be explaining in his speech.
Thank you, PM, for the speech. Guys, keep in mind we're self-timing, and keep in mind to not overtime. So with that, we have the LO to give the speech. Thank you.
Okay, just give me a second.
Yeah, sure.
And can you time yourself?
Yeah, sure. Okay, I will begin in 3, 2, 1. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we understand that the rights of bodily autonomy is harmed, and it happens on both sides of the house, right? But in opening opposition, we will emphasize that the harms of the victim needs to be redressed as fast as possible and as immediate as possible in order for us to alleviate their emotional pain. And I think that in this case, out of court settlements should also be allowed, because we need to also count not only for the society's consent and welfare outside the court and outside the victims harms, but we also need to count that their emotional and bodily pain in order for them to feel happiness. Because notice that opening government's case is very long term, and I'm going to explain later why it is the case, right? So I'm going to talk about two things. Number one, I'm going to talk about why in this case victim will not win in court settlements if we allow them to if we force them to take this case, and therefore that the allowing for the victim to have self-autonomy in this case would also be better. But second, I'm going to talk about why in this case victim using court settlements will using out of court settlements will have more benefits as compared with the forcing them to go to court, right? Okay, let's talk to the first one. My rebuttals will be integrated. So let's talk about the first one. Why in this case court does not give the victims will not have less chance to win. Let's talk about what happens in court, right? How to win court settlements. We have three layers of arguments. Number one, the victims need evidence. The victims need lawyers. The victims need witness, right? In this case, notice that workplace discrimination is hard to prove, because verbal harassment, for example, it's hard for you to get an evidence of it. You need recording, for example, you need witnesses, right? Notice that in this case, this happens within the company, and usually that the one that do this is the CEO of the company, right? Notice that the victims will have a hard time to procure the evidence, for example, getting witnesses, for instances, and let them talk in the front of the court, right? Most likely that their friends will also be coerced by this CEOs in order for them to not, for example, talk in front of a public, right? The nature of workplace discrimination in status quo is that most of the victims will have a hard time to win in the court, even if, for example, you have, let's say, juries, right, which is very natural, for example. Notice that these victims usually are low member, staffs, for example, and they do not necessarily have enough money to hire good lawyers. As compared with the company that has a lot of money, they can just hire a lot of lawyers and then skew the truth out of the victim's voice, right? Even if that, for example, that the victim has a lot of friends in their workplace, it doesn't mean that they will win in the case of workplace discrimination. Notice that I'm not talking about in this case that the victims will never have their redress, for example, because we also agree that there's a lot of NGOs, for example, that helps this victim, especially women, for example, in order for them to win in court. But what if that the victim do not want to bring this into court because it costs them a lot of money, for example? Number one, because victims, for example, victims in this case needs to, for example, get in and out from the court, right? They need money to travel, for example. If they held in the court, they cannot work. It results in the harms of other their victims families, for example, and it harms their financial financial stability. But moreover, this victim already feels that they already feels emotional instability because of the pressure from their peers, pressure from the CEOs, for example. Because notice that in this case, most of the companies will got a lot of fire in their in their rears, for example, because the victims open this in the court and companies will hate them for it. This is not only happens to the victim that is currently in the court, but also it happens to the victims counterparts. For example, let's talk about let's say if the victim is Chinese in Indonesia, for example, most likely that the racial profiling will happens, right? Identity harassment will also happens inside this place. So moreover, if they have other employees which has Chinese background, for example, they also will be harassed outside the system, which results in the victim feel more emotional harms and balance. Now, notice that because in the within the argument, it is hard for the victim to win. Then what will happen if they, for example, go towards out of court settlements? I think it's very intuitive to say that out of court settlements means that the victim just do not want to put this into fire, and I think that companies will also take it take it out as compared with the court settlements, right? Why? Number one, because notice that company do not want to get their companies is also dealing with the medias, right? Company needs also to deal with the image that they bring, for example. Notice that the goals of the company is to make the victim be quiet, for instances. I know that this is bad, but in this case, at least a victim will get a direct redress and more power. How is this so? Number one, victim can use this as a threat to get compensation as compared with bringing this into court. We say that it's justified because the victim is the one that is most likely going to be harmed, and the victim, say, for example, woman wants to get outside this hassle court settlements as compared with going through a very long trial, for example, with results in probably nothing, right? They're going to be lose, for example. In this case, I think it's better for us to have the victim have stronger bargaining chip in order for the company to accept the deals to the media that do not want to get their ass on fire, for example. Look, even if it's a form of redress, I think that it's at least it's a form of material settlements, right? For example, it will settle the emotional settlements. For example, if the victims need money, for example, I think that the material settlements will also suffice. But moreover, this also alleviate their emotional damage, for example, because yeah, for example, the woman gets harassed, but for perhaps it's only a verbal harassment, right? But at least, for example, the money can help the families to get better, for example. I think it is a better form of emotional redress as compared with going to court with nothing to have, for example. Look, let's rebut a case from the government side of the house, right? Number one, they talk about society as an agent of change, for example, and it's morally important for us to include them. Okay, notice that a lot of NGOs has already there. We notice that the court needs to also improve, right? But in this case, it's a very long time progress, and the victim needs an immediate redress for them to be able to, operate, longer. For example, most likely if they put in the court, which has a very long time, settlements, the victim will already feel stressed and the life will be in ruin. We do not like that, right? Because notice that if the victim gives consent, for example, consent is also an important term for the victim. If the victim gives consent, that means that we should allow them to do so, because notice that the debate is not happened in the vacuum. This also, the victim has two choices in this case, right? Therefore, if we put this in the form of redress, at this case at least, that the victim will have a short-term, will have a direct redress as compared with the long-term, settlements that will not give to victims more harm than good. So to sum up, number one, we think that the victims will have a hard time to win in court, and second, that the out-of-court settlement should also be available for the victim to get the immediate redress that they need, that they should have. And the more arguments will be explained from my deputy leader of opposition. Thank you.
The speaker spoke was 7:50. With that, we have the TPM. Guys, keep in mind you guys don't overtime. Thank you.
The kind of case that opening opposition brought in this debate is unacceptable on not only a principle level but also in the practical level that they wanted to take this debate on. I'm going to prove to you in my speech that is the case. I'm going to add some details as to why enough justice is not served when out-of-court settlements have the status quo, and why it creates this the existence of these kind of settlements. It creates this narrative that is harmful in the short term and in the long term. But let's deal with their case anyways, right? First of all, they come here and talk about this idea of how victims will lose in court. We say it's extremely unlikely in the status quo, when these kind of things, when the recognition of women's rights and recognition of women's place in the society is much more is increasing in the society. We talk about this idea of money and lawyer stuff, right? We say, okay, first of all, various NGOs and INGOs that work there to serve these women, and also the idea of help them. We say, secondly, when they talk about the idea of evidence, we don't think this evidence is extremely hard to collect, right? Especially when we create this narrative by removing this out of court settlements and making them go to courts. We say this kind of the narrative that we say that we are here to listen to your pain is something that can motivate these women, things like secret microphones, and use different kind of mechanisms like different other mechanisms that can be used as a viable evidence in court. We don't think that's a necessary problem. But second, also thirdly, understand there are different other kinds of the friends and different people who witness these kind of harassment occurring at a daily level, who are also ready nowadays because of the fact that we have increasing moments and increasing recognition in a social level about women's rights and why we should. So second, they talk about this idea of redress, which should be redress to the victim, which is necessary in this debate. So when they talk about emotional redress, we think it's unlikely to happen under their side, because the mindset that women accepts after these kind of settlements is that they're living in a society where they are supposed to make deals out of their bodily autonomy, where they're supposed to feel better about what happened to them with the money that they are given with. We said this kind of continuous objectification means that they have lesser long-term immobility on their side, not only short-term as well. Secondly, this talk about how money is provided on their side, and why that helps the victim to get over things, right? Firstly, we say these kind of situations can also happen outside. That is to say, we can create these kind of monetary payment, making it mandatory even in court settlements. But secondly, understand the existence of NGOs and INGOs, different kind of social awareness, means that these kind of women increase better care and support, or otherwise in these kind of situations. We don't think that's a problem as well. The closing opposition talk about this idea of victims' consent, and also the opening opposition as well. We think that's we have three responses to it. First of all, the idea that victim is consenting to this act is necessarily predicated on this assumption that this victim is eating up the mindset that it's okay for these things to happen. It's okay for these things to happen to her. We think these kind of mindset is what we want to remove from opening government, that they engage to this analysis, right? But second, understand how the notion that state has failed him, that the law has failed him, is something we should remove and we can solve, right? By providing better lawyers, by providing better public lawyers, by providing greater INGOs and NGO support. We say these kind of things can be removed. This notion that state is not looking after it. But secondly, understand the very existence of this happening in the status quo also perpetuates this narrative that the state does not listen to harassment victims. We said this necessarily means making the situations worse off under that. But thirdly, understand the stakeholder is not only the current victim itself. We said the greater stakeholder is the society in large and future victims, which we are going to prioritize in this debate, because these are the ones who have harassment has not been done. These are the victims which we can prevent harassment from happening. Understand firstly, why is enough justice not served under their side? Again, my premise also brought out. First of all, what does harassment do to the? Firstly, it does it creates this notion in your mind that someone else right values more than your right to bodily autonomy. It creates this self-perception in the woman that her voice does not matter in the society. It creates a perception that her pain does not matter. We say this entrenchment of these kind of narratives means that the punishment should be just and enough. But we say punishment is not just when there are these things like elements. Why? Because the way as to how we can decide kind of punishment is just is to collective moral standards that the society set for himself, and the itself. The collective standard, obviously in this case, is the law itself. So we say the punishment done by law is the only just one that can happen. Yes, PY. PY.
Okay. Why do you think, in moral perspective, that societal good in the terms of feminist movement is far more better comparatively with the victim-centric immediate redress movement?
Because we think there are more future victims that can be prevented. But secondly, we have also proved to you why it does not get redress under your side as well. So what are the negative social impacts of having these kind of out-of-court settlements? Firstly, we see perpetuates harassment. Firstly, because the mindset that harassment is okay because I have money is something that is still existing in the mindset of the harasser, which has not been removed through experiencing jail time, for instance, through getting different kind of social stigma associated with his identity, like we do outside. But secondly, understand that it also entrenches this narrative that harassment is not a big enough deal in the society because of the fact that it's created with money as well, which it creates this idea that women's bodily autonomy is comparable to mere money in the society. We say this entrenches sexism at its most deepest level. We say we should remove that. But thirdly, understand these kind of individuals still remain in power, right? On their side. Boss is still the boss. The CEO is CEO. This means, firstly, that this mindset that this my right to desire more than someone else's bodily autonomy is still existing in that person's mind, means that this person is much more likely to engage in more harassed future as well. But secondly, understand that this person having this narrative, having this mindset that his desires matter more than the need or right of a woman, means that this person is much less likely to support things like social progress. This person is going to go against social, like women equality, like gender equality. This person has this mindset that his rights matter more, and any kind of movement that goes against his power in the society is something he should oppose. This means that this person existing in this power opposition, having political and social capital over the people in society, is something we do not want in both sides of the house. Very proud to propose. Was it not audible?
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Audible. So now we have the next speaker from side opposition.
I'm audible, right?
Yes, you are.
So I'll be starting in about a few seconds. Ladies and gentlemen, the entire case of side proposition is based on the conclusion that the court that they believe in will give them justice. And we have time and again proven to you that this does not happen. So how did we tackle the case that has been presented to us? We say that an individual who is a victim in this case has very less chance to acquire financial capital to go against the entirety of the court system. And also notice that there are several structural barriers preventing these victims to attain justice in the first place. The kind of money that this employer or the company has is certainly so far much that it can prolong this case for infinite time due to the various different reasons, due to the difference between the lawyers they can afford, due to the procedures they can change, also, and about many different things they can control. They tell us that the idea of harassment is normalized in the society because of that. We say that it's more to ask from a victim who has just been harassed, and the nature of the harassment is so personal to the victims that these victims are in the best position to decide what is good for them. A person who just experienced a lot of emotional and physical trauma, you are bringing them to the court in which he or she is more likely to lose, and in that kind of scenario it's very difficult, since we have told to you, due to the proceedings in the court are very difficult. It's very difficult for them to attain justice, and this harassment is even going to brutally hurt once they lose the case in that kind of system. Also, notice there are grounds to dismiss the case. The judge may decide in a way how a reasonable jury would decide, and on the basis of the summary judgment they can easily dismiss this kind of case, because so many different this kind of cases are false accusations. When these are actually false accusations, it will be negative rhetoric attached to the company of the employer because of the public nature of the case. That is to mean that these people must be allowed to that these people like the employer must be allowed to positively dismiss the case when this is wrong by the settlement or whatever thing, because we do not necessarily can count on this system to give justice, because it's contingent of so many different facts. Also notice that opposition questioned that society is the major stakeholder as well. We say that we get better success rates among victims in our side. That is to mean in opposition to the society where things are slower and more difficult for the victims. So what have we debated in this debate? So firstly, we are going to be talking about how out of court settlements which are financial in nature is actually closer to this victim, and the certainty of collection and the finality of all of this is better for them. Secondly, why antagonizing the employer can be a problem in their side of the house. Also, when it goes wrong, it hampers the reputation of the, when it is actually wrong, it hampers the reputation of the workplace. When it is actually right, the employer can use the connections that he have to go against these people. So now we are going to be talking about financial settlements. Notice that these companies have access to better resources and things as such. Now, since this can prolong forever without these victims getting justice, this employer has an incentive and a reputation to protect. Also, the kind of people who the evidences in this kind of places are very difficult to extract. It is again a very ridiculous claim to be made that we put microphones in places which the employer designed so that these women might get justice. It is again ludicrous to assume that these people who work for these employers are going to come on against this employer in the court proceedings, which is a public nature of this crimes, and an employer, because he has very high connections in this regard, can easily destroy the life of the victims in this job and the future to come, because we have already told you that this is very less likely that this victim will win the kind of thing in the court. Also, this loss of these victims in the court would mean that the other women who are actually discriminated against, who are actually less discriminated against, would less likely to now go into the court and have lesser faith in the justice system. So we say that we need to rather attack at the preventive aspect of all of this rather than after the crimes have been committed to decide for ourselves whether or not this is true. That is to mean there will still be people who want to settle it in court, but we should not actually ban out of court settlements. That is to because it's very demeaning for the opposition side to ask for an individual victim to go to that kind of access, because notice that there is a privacy violation in there. The questions that they need to appear for in and out of the court, the kind of scrutiny they are going to be facing from the opposition lawyer on and off the stand, and the kind of things that are private to them are going to be have to brought forward in this kind of debate. And this is particularly antagonizing. Even if they win the case, they would be
Hello, I really can't hear you. Like, I can hear nothing.
hello. My internet connection just reset. Can I? Hello. Am I audible?
Yeah. Yeah, now
So
you're
can I
audible.
continue from 5:30?
Okay, can hear you now.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
5:30.
I can continue
So,
from 5:30, right? So okay. So in many instances, the kind of witnesses, like the expert witnesses, they charge for their time, the time to travel, time to testify, time to prepare for this. And since there can be many witnesses for that particular case, it is far too much of burden for a victim who has faced so much of trauma in this kind of instant. We say it's necessary that we connect this, we control this kind of harm at the preventive layers and not at the corrective action after the crime have been committed, because this requires the public humiliation of such victims and sets a precedence for further cases, that people will be more afraid to get into court because most of these cases are lost. And even if they are not, the lives of these people are lost. The kind of stresses, the emotions that this affects the financial capital that these people have. Also notice that court settlements usually end in less amount of money being compensated to the victims, as opposed to the settlement that occur out of court. That is to mean it's far too much of financial investment to make for far too less return on that kind of case. Also, they make sure that these people are punished, but only if that is proven. And also notice that they do not do anything to uplift the standards of the victim who have been violated in that process. We say that the kind of solutions proposed by the opposition side are better public lawyers and things as such, which requires a structural change in throughout the society. And it is very difficult to incentivize people to have better public lawyers, because it requires a lot of capital for that. Also notice that state in the present scenario does not listen to the victims. Do you think that the victims should put themselves in harm's way by coming into court to make state listen to them? It is, when it clearly doesn't in the status quo. It's important that we uplift the status quo in the first place before we make this kind of decision. So we should allow the out of court settlements to take place. We are very proud to oppose.
with that, we've come to the end of the opening half of the debate. Moving on to the closing half, the member.
Give me 1 second to set up my stopwatch.
Sure.
Here we go.
Ooh, Abrar.
3, 2, 1. One major distinction that needs to be made in this debate is that while we do acknowledge that there are multiple structural barriers in place that make it very difficult for victims to win those cases and get closure, in which world is it more likely that those structural barriers will be slowly eroded away and the pushback will be enough to warrant society to introspect greater? More importantly, even on the internal level, within the minds of the victims themselves, in which world do they find greater closure? If we prove that we win those two grounds, then we take the debate home. So, firstly, on the matter of closure, understand that even if they get immediate redress, at the moment in time when you make that decision, there's an immense amount of pressure on you. That is to say, you can't account for every moment in the future, right? So, when you take that hush money and you think you'll stay silent for the rest of your life, you're not really accounting for the fact that you're a human being with fleeting and transient emotions. That is to say, it's very difficult for you to stay silent at all times, especially when, as opposition themselves said, the harassers tend to be men in positions of power. That is to say, they could be CEOs in corporations, they could be people like Cristiano Ronaldo. So, in those instances, what tends to happen is, since these are prominent individuals that you get to see on television or influence policies when it comes to legislators on a day-to-day basis, the sheer amount of effort it takes for you to keep blaming yourself for the action that happened, because the entire nature of hush money is it is transactional in nature. Even though the harassment was not consensual in nature, you never consented to being sexually harassed. You never consented to the racist remarks being made in a workplace that made it very difficult for you as an African American or person of color, or even as a gay person, to survive in that workplace. Even though you never consented to it, it looks as if it is okay because there is a transaction that's okay, as if the pain that you feel based on your identity being violated could be taken away based on a transaction of money. More importantly, O themselves concede that a lot of pro bono lawyers take on these challenging cases because they feel like they deserve to be represented, not for the sake of the money, but because they feel that these structures and positions of power need to be challenged. Understand that your boss, the person that has paid you that hush money, is in a position to decide your proximity to your boss. That is to say, they get to decide which days you turn up for work, when what kind of assignments you do, because they get to allocate you to your department and to your specific workplace, and they decide how far up the career ladder you can climb. The problem is, if these Lord Voldemorts or these unnameable monsters that everyone is too afraid to talk about remain in those positions of power, they can continue to hire those vulnerable individuals and harass them because they feel uniquely empowered. If they get away with this once, they feel like they can do it again. More importantly, understand that this must be a top down change. That means, since it is a post Me Too world, you must reflect that the stories are already out there. A lot of women have bared their souls and shared their pain with the world. And even individuals who previously thought the extent of harassment wasn't that great are slowly starting to look around them and try to be more actively empathetic, because they feel now that even their friends, even their sisters may have been exposed to this, something that they didn't previously know. Since this consciousness has slowly started to form, now is the best time to create this structural shift. And this can only happen if you take away one of the biggest bargaining chips of these individuals. Everyone here has probably heard the music of R. Kelly, and everyone here has probably known that R. Kelly won at court. But understand something important. Even if those individuals like R. Kelly win at court, what tends to happen is people who consume their music, people who form their fandom around him and hero worship him as their role model, start to question their views based on him. Multiple individuals have stopped listening to R. Kelly's music or actively gone out to Twitter and say that they no longer call themselves their friends. John Legend has done this. More importantly, they've deplatformed his music from Spotify, right? So even if you can't directly win the court case itself, the surrounding discussion that happens as a result of that directly affects those individuals. As O has conceded, this is a matter of image. Now, they also say that since it's a matter of image, these companies will indirectly make it very difficult for those people to continue their careers. Understand, it is already immensely difficult for you to continue your career, even if they give you immense amounts of money, because the internal shame you feel. Many of these societies perpetuate victim blaming culture. That means a lot of women feel like they were the ones responsible because of the clothes they wore, because of the behaviors they did. Understand, when that is the case, this sense of self-shaming is far worse than any kind of career problem that can happen, because even if you're not earning that much money, at the end of the day, if you can feel happy with your sense of self, that itself is far more valuable, because you take yourself back home. Your money can only get you so far. More importantly, things like rape kits, which the police have in their hold, they don't give them proper weightage, because oftentimes the evidence is only kept there for a certain fixed small period of time, right? But slowly over time, as people started questioning the norms and the behaviors of those in positions of power, such as the police, such as the CEOs, they had to be more careful and toe a more careful line because they felt more accountable than they had ever done. Everyone in this house admits that those in positions of power have far more disparity, but understand, even in the worst case situation where you can't win the court case, the very fact that you had the courage to go out there and share your story with the world empowers those around you from your communities. Before I proceed, Kazi, Fardeen, any POIs? Any POIs from closing? Okay, seeing none, I move on. Last minute. Understand that there are multiple instances in which individuals have felt that they could never win in those court cases. But in one particular instance in America, two legislators used public funded money to use as their hush money. They were going to get away with it, but another case came to light in which the ethics committee started looking into the paper trail of how that money was being spent, and the previous two instances came to light, forcing those legislators to resign. This made people question what kind of individuals were legislating policy on behalf of women. Understand, it is very unlikely that individuals will start talking about smaller instances, but whenever this gains more traction, when this goes public, especially in a court which is seen as more official than an water cooler conversation, this will stop being gossip and it will start being something that matters. Perhaps the media will sensationalize it, but at least it will lead to more reflection on behalf of society. Women have come forward already, but it is not time that they start getting justice. Therefore, we're incredibly proud to propose.
Op member.
Just give me 1 minute. I mean, like 30 seconds.
Daniel. Hello.
Wait,
Yeah,
just
you're
give me
on.
10 to 20 seconds. It's my timer. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So, what sign government have been telling us so far is that they want a world where they want to give like women justice because they want to highlight the issues that these large corporations have been doing so far. What they fail to understand is that these women would not really actually want to go to these court settle, like go to court so often as they really think that they would, and that they believe that that these out of court settlements are like a course choice when in reality it's a completely rational one. So we as side closing opposition believe that a true stakeholder of this entire matter are the uh, marginalized people that are happening. And firstly, understand why this is completely different from like other sort of matters such as like murder and rape is because in these cases, in these civil cases, you are completely alone by yourself and you don't have the state to actually help you, like such as in cases such as like murder or rape. So we'll be proving three things. Firstly, why going to court would harm these people financially. Secondly, why it is very traumatic for these people. And thirdly, we're going to prove why it is a rational choice to actually take these out of court settlement things. So understand that when we are talking about these minorities, we're usually talking about women who feel like face sexual discrimination, or like other racial minorities who face racial discrimination. And because these people are individuals who have like faced so much systematic oppression in the past through like slavery or sexist policies, in the current time, there are usually people who do not have enough resources to support them in court. Compared to that, We have large corporations who have large amounts of money, who can usually afford like expensive legal teams that can hold a case for like extended periods of time. So what does this mean? This is like important because these large corporations understand that the people that they're going against simply cannot afford lawyers for that much time, and because of this they usually attempt to extend their case for like long periods of time until these very individuals are no longer able to like support their lawyers and just end up in a state of financial instability. And even if these individuals do succeed, they were still forced to stay inactive for long periods of time, meaning that they still do not actually really win out in the end. So, secondly, all right. So, why is this important? Because if these people do not win out in the end, other future victims will recognize that going to court isn't really a viable solution, and it will just simply tell them that maybe we shouldn't do this. Secondly, how is it traumatic to these individuals? Understand how these victims are usually already parts of disenfranchised groups who like are already oppressed by society and etc. When you force these people to go to a court to fight for a case that's like most likely to fail, we believe that is absolutely horrible. So these people, when they go to court, they're usually people that do not want to actually remember the traumatic experience that they faced in the workplace and etc. These experiences are so traumatic they just do not wish to actually talk about any further. So when they go to court and they have to face intimidating individuals who repeatedly question them about their very traumatic experiences, it makes them feel disgusted, and it doesn't they are not willing to extend their case. Again, irregardless of how their case concludes, which we already proved that they're likely to fail, it causes the future victims to simply not want to undergo the same experiences. We on side closing opposition believe that it's extremely horrible to force these people to relieve their trauma and horror. So finally, we are going to prove to you why this is like going to out of court settlements is a rational choice. So understand that when these individuals are aware about these financial and emotional impacts about going to court, it is most likely that they will make a rational choice and a coerced choice. They understand that sure they will get the public spotlight and maybe they will get media attention and some justice, but it is most likely just not going to be successful and they will just feel worse in the end. We've already proved to you why it is most likely to fail and why they would feel worse, but we still recognize that there will still be people that want to go to court, and so we do not oppose that. However, when side government tells us that they want to completely ban out of court settlements, we believe that is extremely disgusting because you're taking agencies from the very victims themselves because you're forcing them to go through a process that's often significantly likely to fail. Before continuing any POIs, I'll take it from OG. OG. Hello. POI from OG.
Given that these people, as you've already recognized, these corporations are mostly afraid of courts and the negative publicity, don't you think that deterrence is greater on side government?
No, we believe that it's not a greater deterrence because, like, understand that this is a very like short-term solution because just people will not be willing to go to court in the end. Uh, in the future, you'll simply see individuals just simply not report their cases or like not even try to do anything because they recognize how many problems there are. So the reason we believe we win this debate is because we, as closing opposition, are the only side that takes into account that people do not want the public spotlight just because they're the most vulnerable. We are proud to oppose.
Thank you. Now for the government whip.
Okay, just give me a minute. Alright, start timing in 3, 2, 1. Well, as closing government, when Abrar comes up and talks to you about the closure that the victims will be getting if they don't sign an NDA or take any other form of out-of-court settlement and instead go to court, he is telling you that the primary stakeholder of this debate are the victims themselves. Why is this important and distinct from OG? Understand this, when OG is coming up, OG tells you about the criminal justice system and how it is harmed when out-of-court settlements are being created and nobody has any actual trust in the system and the system is not being improved, the society is not being improved. They are ignoring the actual trauma that the victims go through, what actually goes through the victims' minds when they're forced to be silent about their sufferings, when they're forced to when they're forced to appear in shame in front of the perpetrators. So what Abrar tells you is that hush money is not actually consensual, that the transactions make it seem like it is consensual. Abrar talks to you about the career trajectories of the victims in the future, and how they're always controlled by the perpetrators or people who can become perpetrators, how the people in the positions of power are always going to be there, and the only way to change the system is through taking advantage of the post-Me Too era and sharing people's stories, at least in the court, and if not possible, outside of the court. Understand this, when you're signing an NDA because of an out-of-court settlement, you even lose the right to tweet about what has happened to you. And we think this is very dangerous. There is a case where Jan Harmon from Community had harassed a fellow scriptwriter, and since she did not have to sign an NDA, she could tweet about it, and the writer was forced to publicly apologize and recognize his behavior. And understand this, when you're going for an out-of-court settlement, you lose the chance to say anything about these things at all. And Abrar also tells you how victim blaming happens more in the world that opposition has created and not in our world, because in our world, as the MO comes and talks to you that the victims are repeatedly made to relive their trauma because of the interrogation and the evidence collection process that goes on. What it means is that victims can actually reflect on what has happened to them and understand that what happened to them was not actually their fault. They can understand how the system works. They can understand how to disrupt this system. They can understand how to advocate against these things and create a world that will be better for them and for the generations to come. Now, moving on to Emo's case, what Emo comes and tells you is that individuals going to court is monetarily harmful for them because these people do not have enough resources. They've always been oppressed in the past. But the thing is, they're at least not being forced to be silent. So even if there is some sort of monetary harm there, we believe that at the end of the day, it gives them a better chance of closure. And what are you going to do with your money if you're not at peace with yourself? Your productivity is going to be harmed. You will not have mental peace, so you will not be able to properly work, and you're still under the thumb of your perpetrator. So understand where your career is going to go. Nothing good is going to happen to it at all. So there's that. Also, as for the trauma, we have already spoken how relieving the trauma can be systematically sometimes a good thing and make people actually advocate against harassment properly and make them understand that what happened to them was not their fault. And as for taking taking out of court settlements being a more rational choice, understand that these victims have been traumatized in a way that makes them feel ashamed of themselves, that makes them feel that they're not worth anything. And what we are doing is that we're giving them back their agency. We're telling them that go out there and speak for yourself instead of just hiding away in shame. That is agency, not just taking some money from a person who has already abused you and dehumanized you in many, many ways. All right, I will take that POI from
So why do you think it is important to tackle the cases of self-victimization in a society where where these men are already seen as potential rapists, when that hampers the companies, when companies' entire business is based on goodwill towards the public?
Well, understand this: when the company's entire business is based on goodwill, they will be forced to kick the perpetrators out. The companies that the perpetrators apply to in the future will be forced to not hire them, will be forced to ignore their applications, and that creates a world where these perpetrators gain less power, where these perpetrators do not get to be in positions of power from where they can control marginalized people, from where they can prey on these people freely. And Abrar also talked to you about how these perpetrators feel more powerful when they think that they can get away with these things again and again and again, which brings me to OO's case. OO tells that emotional pain of the victims is alleviated in their world. The thing is, how will it ever be alleviated if you're always living under your perpetrator's thumb? And because the victims are mostly scared of going to court because, number one, they don't have enough money, which can be solved by going to NGOs or asking other people for support, and number two, because they're scared of the corporate culture itself, and this corporate culture cannot be let to go on. In this era, we need to dismantle this culture, and the only way to do so is by speaking up in public. And also understand that the companies wanting a clean image will mean that they will be more careful about their culture, which creates a better world for our victims. And monetary settlements can never, and as for their argument, the monetary settlements can never, can always make victims' lives better. Understand that this money is not at the end of the day a lot. It will never sustain a person for their life, but a healthy mental state and a healthy professional environment can do much more for a person. And the same thing can be said about a system that supports the victims and a system that protects people from being harassed. With that, we are very proud to propose.
Speakers spoken. With that, we have the final speaker of the debate, the operator.
Hi, am I audible? Hello.
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. Cool. Give me like 30 seconds.
You have a lot of paperwork, don't you?
Yeah, sort of. Okay. Just gonna set a timer. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm not entirely sure throughout any of the government cases as to how certain people opting out of the system of opting for a court trial in any way hurts the ability of people who still want to be within this court trial to get a proper and just decision at the end of the day, right? Because if they're so concerned about like these people who are going to be extremely oppressive, this workplace like corporate culture which is going to be extremely toxic, they themselves talk about how it's significantly easier in this day and age to speak up about these things. Because we're literally in a revolution where like corporate people all over the world are being held accountable for the kind of things they do, because everyone's being spoken, like everyone's speaking up about it. It means that in the context that we're in right now, it's easier for people who want to speak up to get that kind of environment. It's already there. But for the people who don't want to, it means that it's significantly the type of people who yet don't want to, despite how easier it is in this day and age. It means these people go through some significant amount of trauma for these people to still not want to speak up about it. It means that this debate isn't about people who want to speak up about it, because they themselves concede that that trauma is something, or like if these people want to, they themselves have the avenue to speak up about this. What both sides of government never consider are the type of people who don't want to speak up about these kinds of things. But understand that even at their best, right, they must understand that they just can't use these people as a battering ram to somehow like just try to bring about social change. Because for these people, the horror and trauma that these people go through, and these like both government sides admit to, is oftentimes so visceral, it's oftentimes so traumatic, it's oftentimes so tragic, that just not being able to relive a second of that trauma once more is what gives them relief from there on. These people don't want to be under the eye of the public scrutiny, day in, day out, questioned by lawyers who have been paid millions of dollars to make these individuals' lives a living hell, just because once they questioned the system, they questioned their workplace. These individuals who are never catered to under side government are people who get routinely screwed over, because understand these are people who like have just faced so much trauma that even in this environment that is significantly more hospitable, a side government comes up and wants to talk about, these people don't want to. What is this debate about? This debate isn't about people who at the end of the day want to speak up, because understand side opposition isn't against people who want to speak up, isn't against people who feel like they can make a change, because we feel even in the best of like in a significant majority of like decisions, these are people who are realistically be able to make some sort of assessment as to whether they can like make these kinds of decisions or like do well in court or not. But like understand that most of these people like these kinds of decisions, but oftentimes they literally do so because they want that money, that little form of compensation, that because of all the horror that they have given, people often opt into these kinds. What does this mean? It means a few things. It means that first, these people like it means that first these people who literally opt in for these kinds of reasons do not get that compensation. But secondly, this compensation in itself is often not little to begin with, because understand the fact that these are individuals like corporate people who would often not rather want to like let these things go to court in the first place, because as government concedes, it often leads to these people themselves getting a hit on their reputation, getting a hit in terms of their social standing. It means that the type of or the amount of compensation they're likely to receive is something that is also likely to be high in nature. But lastly, understand something that is something that everyone ignores to begin with. So how it's going to deter people from even wanting to speak up about it. Because in a significant majority of cases, these are people who are just going to lose these cases, because these are people who are extremely rich, who have like a legal resource to not only hire the best of lawyers, but to stretch out these kinds of trials for as long as they're possible or for as long as they want, which is extremely problematic for these people, because every second that these people stretch it out, and they stretch it out willingly, is another second of being forced to relive the trauma of that they have had to go through. Even if understand that these are people even if there are people who want to do or relive this kind of trauma, are okay with it because they want some sort of change, I'm pretty sure they can still do so. But if the trauma is so bad that they don't even want to take another moment of it and just want to settle it out of court, we don't think these are people who should ever be forced to make this kind of change in their lifestyles, should ever be just be forced to have these kinds of decisions in their lives. But why do we win this debate from closing opposition? And what are the things that we've proved to you that we believe that just wins us over the entire debate, right? First, we talked to you about how it isn't necessarily about whether or not they can win this court battle or not. Because even if it is true, as OG of CG would characterize, that it's easy to win this court battle these days. it also like at least easier compared to before. It still means that the people who don't want to go through the trauma are probably not the people who are scared of losing these battles, but more likely the people who just doesn't want to relive the trauma. So people who are scared, or so people who don't want to go through these things are people who have suffered the most significant amount of trauma are the types of people involved. Number one. Number two, even then, it still doesn't take into consideration the fact that most of the time you're still just not going to win the legal. They never take into account. Yeah, but before we move on, closing over.
To understand that many times when cases like Bill Cosby happens, people come out 30 years down the line, right? So even now, when they feel the most intense trauma, there's no guarantee that 20 years down the line they won't have more support to deal with it.
Could you repeat that? I couldn't hear that part.
Sir, oftentimes people in this moment feel intense trauma, but 20 years down the line, there's no guarantee that they won't be able to deal with it with more emotional support structures. Like Bill Cosby's Outers came out 30 years later.
Alright, cool. Okay, like first, I have no idea what the support structures don't exist under our the 200-year world. I'm pretty sure like things like family or things like those, all those NGOs you talk about are things that can exist under our world. But the general idea that like oftentimes this like having this out of court settlements is often something that enables these people to move on from the kind of trauma they've had to go through, as opposed to court battles that often like literally go on for years and years and like oftentimes they literally span decades, right? It means that like if you want these people to literally move on from this kinds of trauma, and that's something Abrar concedes is something that's important, right? That means the way you do it best is by enabling these people who want to move on and give them the opportunity to move on if they want to do so. It again isn't about people who want to bring about change. It isn't about people or like trying to bring about change in corporate culture, because that's something that's happening to a large extent anyway, because of all the people that they claim are speaking up already. This debate is about people who are literally getting screwed over by side government because you're literally robbing them of agency at every level, because you're saying the only type of decision you can make is to forcefully tell your story even when you don't want to, regardless of how traumatizing the story is, regardless of how much pain it brings you. We think that's not a principled stance to take from side government, and they clearly lose this debate. Thank you.
With that, we come at the end of the debate. The speaker is requested to virtually cross the floor, shake hands, and I'll give the